Next up, the plastic tip. So for this piece, I started out with some radial noise, just as some base detail. I usually begin my materials with some kind of noise pattern at the beginning. Usually it's just subtle, just so I have a little bit of detail to work from, because I've noticed that usually it's better to have some very subtle generic detail than to have no detail at the bottom of the layer stack. So I often start my materials with some kind of noise pattern, even if it's just very subtle. So I use this to influence the color, roughness, and height maps. Then looking at the reference, I saw that the surface had a lot of very small divots in the surface, so I created this pattern, just a generic noise texture with a high contrast, and then I duplicated it and changed the scale, so I would have two varying sizes. Then I added them both to the color using the color dodge blend mode, and to the roughness and the height. Next up are some directional scratches, which is just a scratched noise texture. I used two noise textures at different scales just to have a little bit of size variation in these scratches, and I added those to the maps exactly like the components before. Next I added the large scratches, which is the same component that I used before on the acrylic material for this large scratch. It's the same map, and instead of painting it onto the model, I decided to actually map each scratch individually, which is a little bit slower, I guess, but it has the advantage of being very high resolution. I didn't really feel like bothering with UDIMs for something so simple, just a couple of scratches, so instead I just went with this node setup, which looks annoying to make, but it just takes a couple of minutes. It's not really that bad. I just add together all these scratches, and since they are multi-channel maps, I again separated the red and green channels, just like before, to use separately in the material. And here you can see how I use them in the color map, the inner part to darken it and the outer part to lighten it. For the roughness, I wanted to have the inner part a lot more rough than the outer part, so two different mix RGB nodes, both set to add but with different factors. And the same thing for the height, where I used flat colors because I didn't want the underlying noise to show up in the actual scratch. So I just used these as masks for a flat color. Next, I realized that there was some kind of weld in the plastic similar to this seam at the side of the acrylic here at the base of this piece. So I created a seam very similar to how I did for the acrylic, again using a gradient texture which I warped using noise textures. I just used an extra gradient to remove this mask from the part where the surface is curved away, so to prevent it from going over the edge. Then I wanted to have the surface behind the seam to be a little different. I saw that there was some more noise in this area, so I created a simple noise texture that I masked to this area behind the seam. And then with these two components, I added the seam to the color and I overlaid the noise. Then I added both of them to the roughness. And then for the roughness, I used a solid color for the seam. And then again, I overlaid the noise pattern. Next, I added the logo. So the logo I just traced. I couldn't find a vector file online, so I traced it in Affinity Photo from a low resolution image. Then looking at the reference, the logo, first of all, the logo the lines aren't perfectly straight. So what I did is I just warped it with some noise, and then the surface of this logo is different from the rest as well. It's more bumpy, more rough. So I added another noise texture, which I multiplied over the mask, which creates this result. Then I take this to lighten up the color. I found that the color dodge mode works really well for the color map. I added it to the roughness and added it to the height. Next are some scattered scratches, which again I use the color dodge mode for the color. I add for the roughness and subtracted it from the height map. And these scratches are just a simple scratch map, which is mixed with a noise texture to lower the density. Then I saw that at the very tip where the plastic meets the metal tip, there is a little bit of bump looking sort of like the seam on the acrylic. So I did a very similar thing. I used a gradient texture mapped using the UV map, and then I warped it with two noise textures just like before. Constrained it to just this area going just over the edge using a color ramp, and that's it. Then I just again used color dodge for the color. I used a flat color in this case for the roughness, and also a flat color for the height map, because there wouldn't be any other detail in this area. The final component are some tiny cracks in the surface. I saw that there were some different types of divots in the material, different scale and shape. So I decided to create this mask, which is supposed to be sort of like tiny cracks in the material. And what I did here is I mixed two different Voronoi textures, one set to the F1 version, the other to distance to edge, and I mixed them together and then cranked up the contrast using a color ramp, and then I just warped them using a noise texture. I used this as a mask for a flat color in the color channel, added it to the roughness channel, and subtracted it from the height channel. And that's the final material for this one. I just added some subsurface scattering to this one, very subtle, just 0.05, with a subsurface color, a more saturated orange, and that's all.